First, it's great to be here with my two colleagues, Tim Kaine, who has been such a stalwart leader in asserting and pushing congressional authority when it looks like we might be going to war, and Adam Schiff, who is always thoughtful and working hard on any issue he undertakes, and this one in particular. Look, Americans tonight are wondering how they're going to pay their bills, and Republicans in the Senate abdicated their responsibility and said, if you want to go to war in South America, go ahead. How does that look? The bottom line is Senate Republicans continually fall in line behind Donald Trump, no matter how reckless, no matter how unconstitutional, no matter the potential cost of American lives. And what happened here is such a glaring contrast. On the one hand, this afternoon, we went to the floor and asked to extend the tax credits by 3 years, and they blocked that. But here they go along with the president who is defying what the Constitution requires and is reckless, really, in my judgment. And the chances of us getting into an endless war are even greater, because when the Republicans rubber stamp everything he does, the constraints go away. Donald Trump said he's not afraid of putting boots on the ground in Venezuela when asked how long it would take, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Even that wasn't long enough. He said much longer. That's not ambiguous. So why wouldn't our Republican colleagues just do what Congress is supposed to do, assert our authority, and say, let's have a debate? Let's say if he's going to go any further in Venezuela, he needs congressional approval. What has happened tonight is a roadmap to another endless war, because this Senate, under Republican leadership, failed to assert its legitimate and needed authority. So, one thing's absolutely clear. The American people don't want endless war. The Republicans who voted to allow that to happen are politically going to pay a price. We've learned that over the years. But the American people don't want it. And it's the American people who have in the past, when we have tried to do this kind of regime change and nation building, it's the American people who have paid the price in treasure and even blood. Americans don't want military adventurism and prolonged conflict with no plan, no transparency, no articulated goals. And make no mistake about it, this vote makes things more dangerous, not less. It emboldens Donald Trump to push further down this reckless path. And so I want to say to my colleagues, thank you. Senate Republicans will continue to do what Senate Democrats will continue to do what Republicans refuse to do. Stand up for our service members, stand up for the American people, stand up for the Constitution. Thank you, Tim. Thanks.
Well, I've done a lot of talking, and you've heard me do a lot of talking, so I don't need to talk long. This is very disappointing, and it's disappointing that my colleagues let the president sort of beat them into submission. I mean, after they voted last week to basically say, this is an important enough issue to discuss in front of the American public, as the Constitution requires. The White House put a full court press on, unlike any I've seen in 13 years here, to stop a public debate about a war. You know, a full court press to stop a public debate. If they were that righteous about the justness of this cause or the validity of their legal rationale, they wouldn't be afraid of a public debate. But they're afraid of that. And so they really went after the Republicans to try to switch enough votes to come up with a different outcome tonight. And the outcome they came up with was interesting. They didn't vote against the War Powers Resolution. They voted that what we've witnessed, 4 months of military action, more than 200 combatants killed, U.S. troops injured, 16,000 troops, and massive military assets arrayed in an armada around Venezuela, and threats for more invasion, threats for more activity, control of Venezuelan politics, control of the Venezuelan economy. They just voted on the floor that that's not hostilities. And J.D. Vance, who made his chops here in the Senate and even as a vice presidential candidate, as the anti-forever war guy, as the focus on the home front guy and don't spend money overseas, comes in to cast the tie-breaking vote for forever wars and end running Congress, and doing it in the Schiff behind closed doors so you're not honest with the American public about it. So obviously I'm very disappointed in it. However, we accomplished some things. Within 12 hours after the vote last week, President Trump announced via tweet in the middle of the night that he had canceled a second invasion that was going to happen in Venezuela. And today, in order to get Senator Young's vote and Senator Hawley's vote, the White House made a number of public commitments to them about Senator Rubio coming finally to do a public hearing before Foreign Relations, and the need for formal authorization if any boots on the ground are needed in Venezuela. These are not sufficient for me, but these were not things that we would have had we not filed this resolution. Canceling an invasion, I think that's a good end. Getting a commitment that there will be no boots on the ground without seeking a formal congressional authorization, that's a good end. Some of the other commitments they got are a good end. Not sufficient for me, but it's taught me something. Following these war powers resolutions is a good idea, because when you do, you make them have to work their ass off to keep their people in the corral, and the only way they can do is actually by making some commitments that they otherwise wouldn't have. Now, we are wise to be wary about commitments by these guys. But when they've made them, and they made them publicly, then all senators can monitor to see whether they actually live up to them, especially those for whom those commitments were critical to changing their vote. So we're going to monitor the commitments they've made, make sure they're good to them. And the other thing we're going to do is this. We're going to be filing a whole lot more war powers resolutions. Because what we've learned from this, and I learned the same thing by filing a war powers resolution after the Soleimani strike in 2019, when you do it and you get Republican votes, it sends a message to the White House that, wow, my people who are hearing from my constituents are not happy about this. And it causes them to take action that they otherwise wouldn't take. So the result today gives me a strong incentive with my colleagues, and we're already talking about this, to challenge the president's bellicosity toward Greenland and Denmark, toward Cuba, toward Mexico, toward Colombia, towards Iran, towards Nigeria. Privilege resolutions that they can run but they can't hide. We're going to have votes on all of these, and they're going to have to whip these votes very hard. I know how hard they'll have to whip to get Republicans to support them on the Greenland-Denmark vote. They're going to have to whip that very, very hard. And so we have discovered a sensitivity and a vulnerability by using this method, and we're going to do it a whole lot more. And with that, Adam, my great colleague, who actually, he and I started working on these together when he was over on the House side, and we were very much aligned on them, and how good it has been to have him in the Senate working just hand in hand on these important matters.
Thank you. Senator Kaine, thank you for your amazing leadership on this. There has been no more zealous guardian of Congress's war power than you, and I think we're all grateful for what you're doing, not just for our institution, but also for service members and their families who are put at risk whenever a president decides to deploy military forces to another country. There should have been a vote on a congressional authorization to use force before we began a months-long campaign of blowing up ships in the Caribbean. There should have been a vote on an authorization to use force before we decided to blockade another country and place an economic stranglehold on another country, something that would be widely considered an act of war. And there most certainly should have been a vote on a congressional authorization to use force before we sent boots on the ground into another country, risked the lives of our troops in the air and on the ground to capture the leader of another country. None of that obviously took place. And the concern I have with the commitment that has been made to at least one of our colleagues is that it only requires them to come to Congress if the president adheres to the agreement with a major military action. They don't consider this hostilities. I don't know what a major military action in their view would be. So it doesn't, to my point of view, put much of a constraint on the executive. But I think Senator Kaine is exactly right. They took the second strike, at least rhetorically, off the table because of the passage of this resolution last week. They made the first commitments to you in having, I think, a hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee as a result of the vote tonight. I hope that is a public hearing. The public really needs to be brought into this debate because I think at its essence, the question before the American people is, should we risk our service members in order to secure the oil resources of another country? I think it is as simple, as basic as that. In my view, the answer is no, we should not. But if the administration believes that we should, if our colleagues across the aisle believe that we should have that debate in the Senate, and they should be put to a vote, and they should vote to authorize it. I think that vote would go down. We're at an extraordinary point where the majority in the Senate has decided, with the help of the Vice President, they will not even allow a debate on this subject on the Senate floor. That is, I think, a tragic abdication of our responsibility. The war powers held by Congress have atrophied for many years in administrations of both parties. I'm not sure they've ever reached this low an ebb. And if we don't assert them, then we are at risk of losing them for good. And I think our service members and their families deserve better than that. So thank you, Senator Kaine, and I will hand it back to you. Please.
I wanted to ask, what do you think it means that Todd Young had to leverage his vote today just to get a public hearing, which I think will be, am I right, the first public hearing on Venezuela military operations? Isn't that the most basic kind of oversight expected of Congress, expected of the executive branch? I mean, same with this idea that he had to leverage his vote to get the administration to say they would seek authorization under certain conditions. Like, what does that say about how much power this Congress has ceded? Not just on war powers. But
The answer is too much and for too long. Here's what I've noticed, Lindsay. We started the year pretty early, I think in March, challenging the president's misuse of emergency powers and the energy declaration, and we got 0 Republican votes. And then we started to challenge tariffs, and we were getting the use of IEPA, emergency to get tariffs. We were getting 2 or 3 Republican votes. And then that's now grown in the last tariff vote we had on Brazil to 5 Republican votes. We started the year in the war power space challenging the administration's use of military action in Iran. I think we got 1 vote. And now we're getting 5 or 3 tonight, but with commitments that were made. I see this as a growing set of cracks in the willingness of my colleagues just to follow blindly. Not quick enough and not sufficient. The way cracks grow is through pressure. And the pressure campaign that I sort of decided to launch by use of these privilege motions, I'm going to file every one I can to challenge emergencies, to challenge unlawful wars, to seek human rights reports, arms transfers if they're wrong. We now know these motions we can file that force our colleagues to go on the record. Don't tell me you're concerned about something. Don't tell me, oh, I would have done it different if I was president. You go on the record and tell me whether this is the right thing for your constituents or whether following their lead rather than Donald Trump's lead is the right thing to do. We've handed too much power on this and trade and war and diplomacy and all kinds of things. We've handed too much power to the administration. So as Adam used the analogy of a muscle that's grown weak through lack of use, the congressional oversight muscle. We're going to give it a lot of exercise. And I think by giving it exercise, that's the thing that is most likely to make it stronger. Please.
Yeah, you're now going to have a chance to ask Secretary Rubio questions about the strategy towards Venezuela beyond the operation, the authorization powers of the executive. What are your main questions about the strategy that the administration is pursuing in Venezuela?
So do you want to, because I have some, but why don't you start?
Sure. Well, I guess I would start off with how can we expect, without having to deploy boots on the ground, that we are going to run Venezuela for the foreseeable future? How is that supposed to work? The whole corrupt apparatus of the Maduro regime endures. His corrupt number 2 is in power. There's obviously little or no effort to bring back to the country those who won the last election in Venezuela? What will we do if they don't comply? Will we deploy our military to safeguard American oil companies and their exploitation of oil resources there? What is the plan to run that country at a distance? And is that the least bit credible? We've invested a lot more blood and treasure trying to run other countries with far less success. So that's essentially what I would want to try to get at.
I want to ask some questions about the legal rationale. So Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State, and he's a lawyer, and it was the OLC at State that issued the legal opinions that I have found so wanting. And so I'm going to ask him some questions about legal rationale. I think, as Adam said, there's a whole series of going forward questions, like why did you decide that Maduro's VP, who has been called Maduro's tigress, should be running the country rather than the opposition leadership that the Venezuelan public just voted overwhelmingly for? And I watched interviews with Venezuelans on the street in the Miami area who were happy on Saturday, but on Sunday, when they saw President Trump declared that Corina Machado was not the right person to be the leader because she didn't have the respect within the country, I saw what a gut punch that was to them. What a gut punch it is to the opposition to see Delcy Rodriguez now as the president. So I want to ask about that. And then I want to ask about when you say the Venezuelans aren't ready for elections, what, the U.S. gets to decide when people are entitled to have their own elections now? I mean, that's an outrage. We wouldn't let anybody make that decision about us. And then I'm going to ask, I have to dig into the, quote, commitments that have been made and try to really pin down what those commitments mean. So there will be an awful lot of questions, but those are some basics.
And if I just add on,
Yeah.
On the legal question, if this was, as they have represented, merely a law enforcement operation, with the military support being used to provide protection for essentially the execution of a warrant on a fugitive, then once Maduro was brought to court in Brooklyn, that would have been the end of it. So if that was the legal basis to apprehend him, what's the legal basis for a continued running of Venezuela? Because that vastly exceeds anything I think their legal opinion would justify.
Yeah, and we can't talk about, I mean, it's outrageous. We really can't talk about the legal rationale because they won't declassify it. In fact, I don't know if this happened to you, Adam. In reading the legal rationale for boat strikes in Venezuela, they bring somebody from the Department of Justice in to sit and watch me read it. That hadn't happened for 13 years. In a Schiff where I have to leave everything out and I can't take anything with me, no administration has ever brought in a minder to sit over my shoulder and watch me read it. And the first time that happened, I had a question in the middle of it, and I thought they were sitting there to answer my questions, and I said, hey, what does this mean? Oh, we're not allowed to answer questions. What, you're just here to watch me read it? I asked my minder today, why is the DOJ sending a minder in to watch me read a legal rationale? Well, I don't know. I've just been told I have to be here to watch you read the legal rationale. They are so paranoid about the facts of this getting out, but we'll be able to dig into some of our concerns when we have this hearing. Yeah, Robert?
On the question of whether or not this was germane because there were boots on the ground, previous War Powers resolution you introduced directly went to the covert action.
Yeah.
And I was curious, what made you not go that route again this time, and if you plan to, because it was the way this unfolded, if you plan to...
Yeah, the privileged resolution is a very kind of narrow thing, and you have to kind of prepare it just the right way in order to get the privileged status where you're entitled to a prompt vote on a simple majority that can't be filibustered, right? And to meet the privilege, you have to say that the U.S. military is involved in hostilities in another nation. The intel community is not part of the War Powers Resolution. The U.S. military is involved, and those hostilities, which can either be active or imminent, are not covered by a congressional authorization. In this case, there was no argument that there was congressional authorization. We argue that this is clearly hostilities, and the motion on the floor technically is, wait a minute, this isn't hostilities. That was what they just voted for. But covert action by non-military actors, there are other ways to challenge that in the appropriations process or in resolutions, but they wouldn't get the privilege that would enable you to automatic and guaranteed vote that U.S. military action does.
As we're pointing out, too, the irony of the fact that this is the third War Powers resolution we've had. Only when the third resolution passed did they suddenly decide procedurally we should never even allow these things to get a vote.
Yeah.
That seems a little too cute, a little too late, but it is obviously indicative of the fact they don't really want this debate to take place. They don't want to have to explain.
Please.
What's our timeline now for seeing future votes on Greenland, on Cuba?
We don't really know. I mean, Adam and I and our colleagues are talking. I think what you'll see is the next tranche that get filed will have some different leads and some different co-sponsors. And I think we all agreed, let's have a Venezuela vote before we file any others. But you will see Iran, Colombia, Mexico, Nigeria, Cuba, Greenland, Denmark. I called it Greenmark earlier today. Greenland, Denmark. You will see them all filed, and they can't block us from having a vote. They may try to turn it into a procedural vote, but a procedural vote is at bottom a vote on one thing. Should Congress be involved, or should Congress vote for its own irrelevance? Should we be a forever war nation on a presidential say-so, or should we have some checks and balances? All these votes are essentially the same vote, and we're going to be having a lot of them. Please.
Yeah, I know you're expressing some sense of optimism that the vote itself, even though it failed today, did lead to some policy change from the administration, and yet at the same time, this would mark the fifth War Powers vote, either on the Caribbean boat strikes or Venezuela itself, that has now failed.
Yep.
Do you see this as a tool that is still possible to work in the future, given that, even if you're saying that you're going to continue calling votes?
Here's my history, and Adam can talk about the history on the House side. So we would call this sort of the third big effort that led to some success. So in I think it was the Trump administration, there was a use of the War Powers Resolution to stop U.S. refueling of jets on the way to bomb in Yemen. And these were Saudi jets, but the U.S. was refueling them. And the administration was doing that without telling Congress. When we found out, we used the legislative history of the War Powers Resolution to say, actually, refueling somebody else's jets on the way to a bombing mission, that's the use of the U.S. military in hostilities. The administration said, no, it's not. We're not doing the bombing. It's somebody else. But they saw the legislative history, and even though we didn't win that motion, they quit doing the refueling. They backed off because they recognized this is cutting against our claim that we're not the pro-war guys. On the Soleimani strike, we got that resolution, no war against Iran, without a vote of Congress. We got through both houses. President Trump vetoed it. We couldn't override, but we noticed for the remainder of term one, he backed off the bellicosity toward Iran. And on this one, we saw the president tweet within 12 hours, I called off the second invasion. Now, he said it was for some other reason other than the fact that we just handed him a loss. But calling off the invasion, doing these commitments, tepid as they are, that shows that this has vitality. Not that we're not going to get a veto-proof vote on any of these. Let me clue you into news that I'm sure is going to be shocking to you. We will not get a veto. Well, we might on Greenland, actually. But if they have to work it so hard to get their own people in line and give commitments, then this is something that I think we can continue to do. I mean, what was your perspective like over on the House side when we were doing these?
You know, I would really only add to what you said by pointing out that events will also be extremely important. It may be that within 24 hours, a resolution on Iran has sudden and immediate relevance. If you look at just the War Powers votes on Venezuela, when it was a campaign of sinking ships and killing people on board, that was one thing, and we had more of our colleagues willing to say they can continue doing that without our authorizing it. That was also a time when they were making the argument, this is not about regime change, we're not going to engage in regime change, and to the degree members accepted that argument, that might have been part of their calculus, then all of a sudden we have boots on the ground and we're changing part of the regime. That's, I think, probably the most significant reason why the vote succeeded last week. So it may depend on, you know, what further military action takes place in Venezuela or elsewhere, but But I'm in complete agreement with what Tim said, and I think the atrophying of a muscle is a perfect analogy. If we don't exercise this power, we will lose it. And even with the unsuccessful votes, we are exercising this power. We are forcing accountability on it for ourselves and our colleagues. I think that's exactly what we need to do. And if they weren't so concerned about a vote that they have the power to veto, they wouldn't have felt the necessity of so deeply intervening to try to stop the debate tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of Delcy Rodriguez and Caracas right now, do you think the fact that he couldn't get over the hurdle and that the president has basically said now he will not do a second strike without coming, or a major escalation without coming to Congress, do you think that removes from their perspective a credible threat of additional action that, you know, may be in support of interests that you share, like elections or protecting American interests? I mean, it's a very volatile situation.
Yeah. There's no interest that I have that would be put on top of the priority list over don't send our sons and daughters to war without a vote of Congress. I mean, there's not going to be anything in Venezuela that's going to make me say, well, you don't have to come to Congress. You know, just do this to protect human rights. So it is a bedrock principle for a military dad. It's a bedrock principle for a guy who represents a super military state. And I got veterans and their families and active duty people and their families coming up to me all the time saying, don't let anybody send our kids into war if you aren't willing to debate and vote on it. So, but in terms of what Delcy Rodriguez is thinking, I can pretty much tell you, and I'm not revealing any intel, I tell you what she's thinking tonight. She's not thinking about a vote in Congress. She's thinking about the power struggle that's underway within all the Maduro henchmen who would rather be VP than her. And there's a whole lot of people down there who are really unhappy that she's the one that Donald Trump has anointed, and they're all in line trying to jockey. And she's also nervous about an opposition that just won an election by a 2-to-1 margin, and they think they're entitled to be in power. I think Delcy Rodriguez's biggest worry right now is, can she hold on to power within the Venezuelan kind of, you know, realpolitik? That's what she's worried about now. All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, good work, man.